Good evening, welcome. Good to see you all. Today we will be talking about two issues which can be connected but can be not. They're connected in the sense that they're both happening with use of computers or smartphones. It's adolescence and gaming and adolescence and social media. So before we go and talk to our presenters, I wanted, as always, share my screen with you to just help you to find these courses and how to book them. Okay, so if you can see it, yeah, Georgina, you can see it, yeah, it's shared, okay?
Yes.
Yeah. Fantastic. So we're starting, as always, with SDS front page. For many of you, it is very familiar now, but anyway, we're always starting at the front page, and the best way to do it is to go and click on All Courses button at the top of the screen. And then you can either search for a specific course, that's very simple, you put gaming in, you'll find it straight away, or you go to calendar view if you want to see what else is available. So you can see that Adolescents and Gaming, we will be running on the 9th of June. It is part of our BPS approved certificate in working with adolescents problems, adolescents issues, working with adolescents. So 9th of June, it's 2-hour short workshop from 12 to 2, we call it lunchtime bite size. So from 12 to 2, only 2 hours, and it's on the 9th of June. And another topic which we will be discussing today is 30th of June. And it's adolescents and social media. Benefits and harm. I guess we could say the same with gaming, benefits and harm, and we will try to cover some of them today. So 30th of June, and that is with Paul Grantham. So adolescent and gaming is with Georgina Rush, and social media with Paul Grantham. So these are the two courses which we're going to discuss today, and that's how you find them. Okay, so I'll stop sharing now. And last thing I want to say, please feel free to type your questions in the chat box as we speak. But if you feel brave and want to chat at the end of this presentation, just put your hand up or unmute yourself and go ahead with your questions when we have questions and answers, okay? So that's all pretty common routine, but now I want to start with a question probably to Paul, because I know that the whole BPS approved certificate in working with adolescents was designed by yourself, I think in collaboration with Dr. Andrew Beck, who is a BABCP president, and that was the issue which you wanted to bring sort of into training because it's not very, very widely covered. But gaming and social media, they're hardly mental health problems. You know, how did it happen that they ended up amongst the modules on this certificate? Because it's somewhat unexpected, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, if I can, that's a fair point that you actually make, Julia. And I guess the first thing to say is that this particular certificate is about adolescent issues. You know, we also, as you know, run a certificate for CBT with children and adolescents, but that's much more diagnostically based in terms of the types of problems that are addressed. And with the certificate purely for adolescents, we wanted to do something which picked up issues, really. You know, not that adolescents don't have diagnosable mental health problems, but there are a lot of things that young people are dealing with, which don't, strictly speaking, fall under the heading of a mental health diagnosis, but are nonetheless issues. And I guess with the question of both gaming and social media, I wanted to include it for two reasons. The first one is undoubtedly, there's certainly a lot that appears in the press, at least, about the connection between these two particular things and mental health problems. So I guess, you know, for both of these, there's an issue around that we often hear about addiction to these particular things. But also, I think it's also seen as providing an overlap with problems like being depressed and so on and so forth. And of course, then quite specifically on things like the social media side, we've got all sorts of things that we sort of hear about in terms of cyberbullying and suicidality and things like that. So it just struck me that it was important for that particular reason to include it on a certificate on working with adolescents using an integrated CBT approach. The other reason, to be blunt with you, was simply because my general impression is that adults generally, and that includes, of course, all of us here who are working as therapists and practitioners, don't necessarily feel terribly familiar or confident about those two particular areas. So, you know, either, and I think this is actually quite common actually, either adults back away from them. You know, whether you're talking parents or practitioners, and there can be a bit of a danger that you back away from them because they feel like they're an area that you don't know anything about. Secondly, it allows all sorts of myths to go running around. So, you know, in a sense, these two modules from our perspective are twofold. Partly they are about providing information to people to, in a sense, educate them about these particular, maybe unfamiliar activities that young people are engaged in. But also as well, of course, to provide some strategies that are particularly derived from CBT in terms of working with young people if and when these create a particular problem in some particular way. So that was the logic really behind why it was that I wanted to include it, really. Yeah.
Well, that's interesting. And I straight away wanted to ask you a question which comes logically out of from what you've said. Young people and these areas like gaming and social media, they are so trend driven, you know, trendy, you know. How can we as therapists keep up with them? You know, there's new names like social media. We elderly people like us are all using Facebook, but young people look down their noses at Facebook. And if we even mention the Facebook in the room, that will push us back, I guess, in our relationship. Same with games, you know, they can give you that, you know, and play this, and you've never heard of it. So the question is to both of you, Georgina and Paul, how important it is to keep up to date, and whether it is important at all, or maybe it doesn't matter that we don't know all these latest trends. So question to both of you, really.
Well, I'll let Georgina go first on this.
Thank you. I guess there's two things there, isn't there? So there was the opportunity to maybe read about it and research. I'm not suggesting that we all then start doing TikTok videos or even kind of, you know, getting the latest like Fortnite and doing the dances that come along with that. But actually, it can be helpful kind of to have that knowledge, but I generally just name that as well. So in a session with a young person, I kind of refer to the fact that, you know, I'm older than them, and so when I was a teenager, this is what was cool, or kind of this is what I know, and ask them questions about it and remain curious to kind of, I mean, more often than not, they tend to laugh at me and probably like make a joke about it, which I find helps them kind of probably feel a bit more comfortable talking to me about that kind of stuff too.
Yeah, I mean, I would sort of say something quite similar, really. I think that, I mean, one of the things to bear in mind, I mean, I can't talk so much about the gaming field, but I would imagine it's very similar, is that, you know, things change so rapidly, really, that, you know, I think that, you know, if you could be confident that what it is that you're going to learn now is going to be relevant in 12 months' time, then it would be worth doing. But actually it's forever changing. I mean, can I just give you an example on that, which is sort of data-based, which is that there's a general assumption that, for example, adolescents don't look at Facebook. That's actually not true, in fact. And if you look at the different social media platforms that are used, Facebook still plays a big role. That doesn't mean to say that things like TikTok and Instagram and Snapchat aren't used as well. And I think to some degree, this is where part of the danger arises really, which is that we form our images on the basis of what's been in news headlines. And actually, I think we've just got to be quite careful about that across the board, in fact. So, I mean, I think it's useful to be aware of what's around, but to be honest with you, I think it's very difficult to keep up. And I would totally agree with what Georgina's actually saying here, which is, in a sense, take the lead from the young person that you're actually working with, and rather than make assumptions and try and be down with the youth on this, I think it'd be far better to basically ask. And basically, if you're not familiar, I still think it's useful to know, can I say? But if you're not familiar, then you go away and actually discover things. I mean, I'll say a little bit about different platforms, certainly in my particular training module. But to be honest with you, this dates incredibly rapidly. So be aware, but take the lead from the young person and then go and do your background work afterwards. Yeah.
Okay, so it's okay to admit that you are probably not quite up there with them on that, and I guess being honest is always an advantage. So coming back to the media coverage of gaming, social media, and our assumptions as parents and other parents' assumptions that they are bad for you, posture is bad, diet is bad, sleeping patterns are bad, you can come across all sorts of dangers, bullying, everything you've mentioned. So again, the question to both of you, how seriously we should take these concerns? Are they real, or are they really blown out of proportion by the media? What would be your position both on gaming and on social media?
Okay, I mean, shall I go first on this one?
You go first,
yeah,
and Georgina will follow.
I think in many ways we've sort of framed this incorrectly, really. So I would suggest an alternative way of thinking about things. If I'm talking about social media here, firstly and foremostly, social media is a tool. And, you know, like any tool, it can be used for good or bad. And for that particular reason, it relies quite enormously on what the state is, or the mindset is, of the person who is coming in to use that particular tool. So why I wanted to mention this is that we got quite a lot of evidence to indicate that, putting this very bluntly, young people who have healthy lifestyles often use social media in a way which is different from young people who have got problems elsewhere in their life. So I mean, I was trying to think of a good metaphor for this, and a chainsaw is not a good metaphor, but, you know, I often, chainsaws are good for good and they're good for bad, you know? And, you know, and I think one of the implications of that, incidentally, is I personally think we've got to get away from seeing social media and the internet as being a totally separate environment from what's actually happening in the young person's life outside of in their offline life, really. And I think, generally speaking, young people today have a greater tendency to see their offline life and their online life as being part of the same, really. So, putting it very bluntly, if it's healthy in one area, it's much more likely to be healthy in another. And that actually it's I think less preoccupation solely with the internet side of things, and having a greater sense of being concerned about the young person as a whole, including what's occurring for them outside, would be a good starting point. Now, I'm not denying that there aren't specific things about social media, for example, which can make problems worse, and that is undoubtedly the case. But what's interesting is on the fairly limited research that's actually around on this, the suggestion appears to be pointing in the direction that, for example, if you have a young person who is depressed, then they are going to be using the internet and social media in a different way very often from the way in which somebody who is not in that particular position is going to be potentially using it. And we've got some quite interesting data, cross-country data, comparing the north and south of the globe. And broadly speaking, the amount of internet use is broadly comparable. We'll come back to that point maybe later on about why that is. It's broadly comparable, but there is quite a strong correlation between the amount of internet use in the Northern Hemisphere and levels of depression. And there is no correlation at all in the South. And when you dig into that data a bit more deeply, it appears to substantially concern what basically the internet is being used for. So, I mean, that comes through obviously in a number of ways, but all I really want to emphasize at the moment is it's not all bad. There's nothing it's like a tool, you know, there's nothing intrinsically, I don't think, bad about it. But that doesn't mean to say that, for example, an unsupervised young person who is very psychologically distressed might be using it in a way which potentially leads them into danger. I wouldn't want to dispute that. I'm just a bit wary of seeing this as being automatically bad news, really. You know, young people actually, for instance, praise the value of social media in many ways. They see it as a way of meeting people that they wouldn't be able to meet otherwise. So it introduces them to a diversity of people. And, you know, they can do things like support a cause, which is important to them, which would be very, very difficult to do if they didn't have that sort of platform. So mixed bag would be probably my view, but I wouldn't have an automatic downer really on social media, you know, per se.
Thank you. So Georgina, the same question to you. In terms of gaming, how would you describe the dangers of that?
Yeah, thank you. So I kind of am similar to what Paul's saying there. So there's something there, isn't there, about the moderation element in terms of how people are using things, but not just focusing on that one area, but thinking about how that works across the whole of that young person's lifestyle. And I think for me, what we tend to get reported a lot about is the extremities, so the extreme usage of things. And that's kind of then where, you know, we might get reports of that in terms of social media, in terms of media, but also thinking about how parents tend to worry about their child. It's the extremes that they've heard, rather than kind of thinking about that being a piece of a puzzle or something that a young person kind of does want to use. And so, you know, there are issues, aren't there? So if we know that if we're gaming too much, it can impact on our circadian rhythm and influence sleep. And we know that if we're gaming too much, we're at risk of becoming socially isolated from family and friends and people in kind of that reality or in the real world. But equally, there are so many benefits and positives about gaming in terms of young people being able to form friendships, you know, and kind of be able to almost relate to people in a way that they might not be able to do if that was face to face or in reality, or kind of they were at school or they met them at a club. That online kind of way of communicating can help them be more comfortable, I guess, to build up that relationship as well. But on top of that, there are kind of proven cognitive impacts that gaming can have, you know, increasing kind of things like problem solving skills, being able to kind of make decisions quicker. So there are loads of good things that come out of that. And also we know that gaming can be supportive with emotional regulation. So if you're thinking about children with ADHD or ASD, you know, there are elements of gaming that helps them in terms of sensory soothing, but also being able to kind of focus on one thing and kind of automatically body regulates while they're doing that. So there are, I guess, a lot of benefits that tend to outweigh the exaggerated version of risk that we might hear. But again, similar to Paul, I'm not dismissing that we're going to have cases where there are young people who might have a mental health difficulty and then they use gaming, and that can then almost maintain some of that mental health difficulty because they're not accessing a more appropriate coping strategy. But also, you know, there are young people that might access gaming that might then form unhealthy views of the world around them. But that isn't just because they're accessing gaming. That's like one contributing factor in that pot, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, totally agree. I mean, the one, just to briefly add before we get into this in any further depth, a couple of things I guess I would want to say. One thing that is commonly forgotten, and which I think is very important to remember and has a particular bearing with children, is that the companies that have set up social media platforms and who run social media platforms, please do remember they have done this for one reason only, which is to sell things. Now, why I mention that is because, you know, that there's a whole issue here, which I personally don't think gets quite the degree of attention it should do, which is more to do with the issue of children being sold things or being appealed to as consumers. And, you know, the degree to which that is okay, not okay. And then, of course, we have the issue that's around about scams. I noticed that Carola has mentioned about what worries about particularly people with learning difficulties being vulnerable to scams. But can I just say, that is obviously an issue that's around for young people generally, and for adults, of course. But I in a strange way, you know, I think the only thing I would say to that is that that's not an insurmountable obstacle, but it does highlight maybe some issues around about the way in which, I suppose putting it bluntly, we are involved with young people when they are actually going to be entering one of those portals. And just to be aware of that. The other thing, which I think is an interesting point that Georgina mentions is, and I'll actually be saying quite a bit about this on my social media module, I think that you can actually think certainly about social media as either something that facilitates coping strategies in the way in which Georgina actually mentioned. And I think there are a number of things I'll be talking about where that is really, really helpful. And we've got some evidence that's just coming through now about using this to basically develop certain skills. However, I could also point, for example, to someone who is very socially anxious and for that particular reason uses a social media platform as a way of interacting with people because they don't actually want to have any face-to-face contact. And there we have potentially the use of a social media platform as a safety behavior, in fact. So we've got a very interesting issue here. Again, it's not the tool per se that's the problem. It's the way it's being used and the relationship with it, which in many instances can be helpful, but equally it can be a hindrance as well. Yeah. But I'll say a bit more about that on obviously on the day.
Thank you, Paul and Georgina. A question probably more to Paul, because as I'm listening to you, and because we are talking about mental health, there are obviously certain mental health conditions which, well, at least notoriously, we know again from the media and some studies, which can provide young people with tools which I would call undesirable, you know, for certain mental health conditions. Sorry, my internet connection is unstable, so if I break, do let me know. So would you be on the day, would you be sort of going specifically over some of the mental health conditions and the dangers that social media can present in that respect, or will it be covered on the day?
Yeah, I will, but I mean, I would say in a strange sort of way, it's not fundamentally different, for instance, from the relationship between a mental health problem and the use of alcohol. In a way, the actual specific mental health condition, if you already have it, is going to be exacerbated very often with alcohol. And I would say exactly the same here, potentially with social media. Can I hasten to add, there's also the additional fact, of course, that alcohol can be used constructively by people. It's not all about a problem. But if it is going to interact with mental health, I think it operates in a fairly generic way. There are some things that I will be specifically highlighting about social media. So we know, for example, that we've now got some information which suggests that young people feel quite reluctant and reticent over the issue of social liking on social media, for example. And we've got some evidence, for instance, of young people complaining that it affects their self-esteem. Young people will withdraw, for example, certain posts if they don't get enough likes on them. And that whole issue of basically making social comparisons, which have always existed, of course, and which I would always argue is actually a direct product of a consumerist society, get amplified quite substantially within the echo chamber of a particular platform. So yeah, there are some things that might actually aggravate it, but I think in a sense it has, basically if I've got a problem, if I'm an angry person, if I am depressed, if I'm socially anxious, potentially, depending on a number of factors, that will end up potentially being, if it's not used in the right way, will end up expanding the problem or embedding it in. But I just wish to add, can I say that there is an argument to be made that the way out of this is actually to simply be using that social media, maybe less, but also most importantly in a different way from the way in which the young person is using it, rather than saying no social media. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Georgina, a quick question about what you've mentioned is that young people can make friends through gaming and meet people online through gaming. I guess lots of people of older generations would say, no, you can't have friends who are just virtual friends. Friends are only people who you're actually meeting in real life. So do you have any anecdotal or research stories of actually people becoming friends and maybe keeping that friendship for any length of time through gaming?
Yeah, so there are quite a lot of young people that I've worked with who will talk about historic friendships that they've made, or when a friendship started and how it's developed, and that they have met this person in real life, and how they continue to game and have made friends. And I guess, when we do think about kind of meeting people online, especially as teenagers or in young people, we do as adults tend to get that almost that gut reaction about safety and that concern. And I think there's a little bit, isn't there, that if we almost, I guess what Paul and I were saying at the start, kind of be curious, let the young person lead, but also kind of think with them about being risk aware, kind of maybe even checking out the friendships, being present when they're talking to this person, or kind of, asking them things like I guess we would have done in the olden days when I was having a sleepover at somebody's house. My mum would have probably wanted to find out a bit more information about that person and about their family. And, we can still do the same online as well. But actually, if you've got somebody who is struggling, I guess, socially, or feels like a bit misunderstood by people who they're connected with, and they've got a friend online, you will find that they will talk about that person in sessions and kind of talk about the benefits of that friendship. And as a practitioner, I would kind of want to be checking out a bit more about that friendship, obviously, in terms of that risk stuff, but also I wouldn't be dismissing it because it's not a friend that's been made in the traditional sense. And I think that's a lot of it, isn't it? So the way that teenagers are communicating currently, whether it's via gaming or social media, it's not the way that we're used to communicating and making friends in the traditional sense. And then it almost becomes, I don't know, like a kind of a scary prospect, or this thing that stands alone that we then assume has got a lot of risk with, or a lot of fear factor with. But I think if we ask about it and show interest, we're probably going to get a lot more out of it than we would do if we didn't.
Yeah. I mean, I would want to emphasize that. I mean, I think that, a key issue here is about adult involvement and adult interest and curiosity. And I think that's a really quite a central idea, really.
Well, in terms of security and safety, I wanted to ask you, because obviously we can't cover it tonight, will you be giving us some sort of safety guidelines in terms of how to lead that conversation with the young person about meeting people online through games, through social media, some sort of safety? I don't want to call the word protocol, but you know what I mean. Will it be covered within the course?
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean there, Julie. So almost like some sort of scripting or some kind of way
Yes.
that we could have those conversations. So, you know, for me, definitely as part of the course, we're going to be focusing a lot about parenting and how as practitioners we might want to work with parents and support parents, because I guess some of the key thing, or one of the key things, I guess, as well, apart from, you know, thinking about that safety element, but one of the things that Paul's been focusing on, or kind of the conversation has been about, is more about understanding the function of that behavior. So if we understand about why it is that our child is gaming a lot, or what it is about that they enjoy, and the same, you know, from Paul's position in terms of social media, we're going to be more empowered as a parent, but also as a practitioner. So absolutely, you know, I'm going to be thinking a lot about how can we work with parents to understand some more of this, and how can we help them to feel upskilled in order to have that kind of conversation, but also thinking about how as practitioners might we approach that with the young person that we're working with, but then how we might approach that with their parent as well.
Paul, same question?
Yeah, I mean, I would totally agree with what Georgina is saying. I guess the only other thing I would sort of throw in is that I will be adding in a few sort of technical handy hints and tips, which can be used either by the young person or by the young person with their parent, in terms of things that you can actually do with the portal in order to actually increase safety as well. But I think, you know, I want to emphasize really the approach that Georgina's taking, which is that really this needs to be a collaborative exercise between an adult and the young person, rather than, you know, the adult jumping in and trying to control what's actually going on in order to make the young person safer.
Thank you. And obviously, because we're talking about integrated CBT for all these problems, so my question to you, where does CBT sit within all of this? Does it have a role? Does it have a place? And how we can use it and for what? Please, Paul, you can go ahead.
Okay, where to start? Really, I think the first thing to say is that there is, I mean, I don't want to get lost in this at the moment. I'll just say it briefly. There is a striking lack, I think, of research and practice, specifically on the social media side, with using CBT. And I'm not 100% about clear why that is, because it's not like it's literally cropped up overnight, but there is. But having said that, there is a lot of research on internet addiction. And that obviously spreads into the issue about social media. And I think, you know, one of the things that I'll be highlighting quite a lot is that there are a lot of well-established and well-tried and tested strategies from the CBT field for dealing with addiction problems generally, and also specifically in connection with internet addiction too. So, you know, there's everything from, you know, underlying beliefs that people have about limiting their use, which might get in the way of them doing it less, looking at the use of building up offline activities sometimes as a counteract to so much time being spent online. We'll be looking at using exposure specifically in connection with this, and also the whole idea, I guess, about using stimulus control methods in order to help the young person to some degree distance themselves from this when they need to. And then, of course, there's the whole thing we've already been mentioning, which is about helping adults to work more collaboratively with the young person in exploring this particular virtual world, rather than, in a sense, letting them get on with it in the corner of their bedroom by themselves. So we'll be doing quite a number of things along that particular line.
It just crossed my mind, sorry, as you were talking, I thought another thing which needs to be addressed is instant gratification. What I've noticed with young people, you know, message bings and they need to check it straight away. You think, are you expecting some important news? Are you, you know, really worried about somebody? No, so leave it. But no, it's impossible. But we all know that ourselves, you know, sometimes we need to check it straight away, even though it is not likely to be something that important. So I can guess that yes, CBT can work with that. Georgina, please, same question to you.
Yeah, thanks, Julia. And what you were saying there, I was thinking about kind of, you know, about that instant gratification, that actually, you know, as adults, we're almost kind of moving into that in a similar way. You know, online shopping, it's just so easy, isn't it, to kind of get something that you need straight away. And there's something there, isn't there, about algorithms, both in gaming, online gaming and social media, and how actually they're created in a way to increase activity and kind of increase use. And so what you might get is you've got your teen at dinner, you're having a chat about the day, and then all of a sudden they've got a push notification that brings about somebody in their game who's overtook them. And so actually they might feel then the need to respond. So I kind of was thinking, yeah, I get that. And I feel like you know, Amazon and other online shops do a really good job with me of kind of sending me emails and trying to kind of get me to buy in there. So similar to what Paul was saying there about actually thinking about, you know, how can we think about moderation, what some of the strategies that we need to put in when we're looking at more of that kind of addiction side of things, the focus again on parents. But I also wanted to think about how can we use some of our CBT strategies when we have got a young person that we're working with, but we kind of recognise as the problem and they're not quite recognising that yet. So we're seeing that maybe gaming is maintaining some element of difficulty, or it might be causing one part of a problem. And so some of the CBT strategies that we might use to think about how we can bring about change or new evidence in that way. And again, thinking about some of the unhelpful thinking that we might notice, or if a young person's kind of got a distorted sense of reality because they've been stuck in the kind of this gaming world, how might we work with them to create some shift to help them kind of get more neutral perspectives and kind of step away from some of those unhelpful beliefs. And, you know, examples are young people that play games that have got age ratings that are 18, and so there are lots of content in there that they might be seeing, and kind of some of that might form some of their thoughts around society or thoughts around friendships, thoughts about relationships, and how might we think together about how we can kind of support our young person to work on that or kind of get a more neutral and balanced perspective.
Mm-hmm. Just as you speak, and I'm thinking about all the other topics, which many of which we've already covered within this certificate, and how many of them are probably interlinked, you know, like we were talking about sexual health, for example, and how is it connected with social media and being on the internet and all of that. So it just, for me, it feels like the topic is just opening up as we speak. We had some very good, interesting comments in the chat box, and Barbara put the reference to what it sounds like a very interesting article. Georgina, you're probably familiar with that, on benefits of video gaming and use of games in psychotherapy. So the field is clearly, it's a new field, and it needs to be explored. So let's just try to answer some questions from the chat box. And as I said, you're very welcome to put your hand up or just unmute yourself, because it's not a very big group, so it should be okay. Let's start with Mary, who says, who decides whether a young person has a problem? Because obviously the young person will never admit that they have a problem either with gaming or with social media. So whose decision is that?
Do you want to go first, or I go first, or what do you want to do?
Do you want to go, Paul, and then I'll chip in?
Okay. I'm going to start off from the assumption that the young person does actually think they've got a problem, but they might not define it in the same way that we do. So I'm sort of interested in, you know, generally speaking, young people do not voluntarily wake up in the morning and say, I can't wait to speak to a therapist. You know, I mean, if they're there, it's because someone's forced them to be there, or alternatively, they're worrying about something else. So my starting point really is the young person's definition of the problem. Now, that I think is a crucial starting point, because we can then start exploring how other factors might fit into that. So we might then explore their use, for example, of gaming, or we might explore their use of social media from the perspective of their definition of the problem. So, you know, the young person may be feeling very scared or very lonely or depressed, and that is how they might be concerned about their parents or whatever, and that's their definition of the problem. Our job, I think, is to recognize that we need to open that up and to see whether these other factors play a role. And I think, what we've both been saying is important here, which is largely to treat these things as potentially neutral. It's more about the way in which they actually are used or integrate with a problem that the young person actually sees themselves as having. So that's where my starting point would always be, which is the young person's definition of the problem from their perspective.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, Paul. And there's something, isn't there, about how do we as practitioners help young people identify safety behaviours? And so if we're saying that the use of gaming or the use of social media is maintaining a problem, that's similar to how we might approach thinking about safety behaviours together with the young person. And so it's kind of almost, we want to shine a light on an area, do some digging around, unpick some of that and figure out, actually, does that feel like a problem? And if not, that's okay. And if it is, then that's great. But also, there is some element, isn't there, that you were saying, Paul, about not, no young person kind of goes, right, today's the day, I'm going to go and talk to my therapist, or I really want to speak to that person. A lot of the time it is parent-led or professional-led. There might be a teacher at school that notices something. And I think even though we might have a parent or teacher that notices there's a problem or feels like this is an issue, if we've got a young person that doesn't really want to talk about it or engage, we're not going to be able to do that work with them. But I guess what we can do, and what it sounds like both Paul and I are thinking about from our sessions that we're going to be doing about these topics, is thinking about how, as professionals or as parents, can we maybe start to approach that rather than it being focusing on the young person and individual led.
Yeah, totally.
Thank you. I can see Florence has her hand up. So Florence, if you can unmute yourself and go ahead. Florence? She's disappeared. Monica, let's go for Monica. Florence, when you can unmute yourself, go ahead. Monica, please.
I have a question. About, I work with adults mostly, but I mean, one of my concerns was, I was talking to my sister the other day, and she's in Colombia, but her husband is a pediatrician, and she was mentioning to me that there's been a raise of cases of children trying self-harm and even trying to commit suicide, because there's been a rise as well in the social media instructing how to commit suicide to young people. So that is quite scary, given that in Colombia they don't control social media.
I mean, I know exactly what you're talking about. I guess I would say what social media does is it potentially makes it easier to find people who might be thinking about the same way of things as you do. And, to some degree, one thing that is both a positive and a negative really with social media for young people is it gives them an opportunity. This is similar to what I think Georgina was saying earlier, which is it gives them an opportunity to basically find an individual or a community that feels like they can belong to. And, not all communities are desirable. That's undoubtedly the case. And to join a community which is about swapping self-harming methods is not the most desirable community for a young person to join. But all I would simply say, first of all, is it's not the only community. And secondly, I think that in a way, this points back again to the important role of discussing things with young people and, in a sense, adults operating much more collaboratively with young people in terms of their use of the media, rather than it being seen as the media itself as being an automatically bad thing. Can I just briefly say something about this? Because I was reading earlier on today something I found absolutely fascinating, which was a series of reports that were produced in the 1940s by a series of doctors who are very concerned indeed about young people having their brains unduly altered and engaging in unsocial behavior because they would start listening to dramas on the radio, which were actually for adults, but which you couldn't stop young people listening to, and the social turmoil that will occur from this. Now, can I just say, and we look at that and we laugh at that now, but I wouldn't be surprised if there have been examples where even then individuals would have engaged in behavior and they would have made a link with the radio drama that they were listening to. And I equally don't want to dispute the fact that radio dramas may have had that sort of influence on some individuals. But I think that's then a big jump to always say radio dramas are a bad thing and that all young people are going down the pan because of it. So I just think it's a tricky thing. I mean, my immediate thought as well with what you're saying is I can see how you can get mini epidemics occurring because people will belong to a particular group in a particular social media platform. But can I also point out, this is not unique with young people to social media. I've certainly seen outbreaks of mini epidemics of self-harm breaking out in particular schools or particular classrooms. I don't know how many of you can remember back to the spate of, and I do want to emphasize this, very unusual suicides in terms of the numbers that occurred in Bridgend in South Wales, must be towards about 10 years ago, because that's a fairly small community. So yes, people do communicate with each other in a small community, but in a sense, I still come back to the point that we've been making really, which is I want to be ensuring that as an adult myself, and if I'm working with parents, that I do this with parents too, that the young person has some engagement and involvement from an adult in this whole field, which I think is the thing that's going to make all the difference, rather than automatically assuming that, you know, for example, social media is a bad thing. You know, I'm trying to find metaphors for it, but it's a bit like, you know, unfortunately, we have not got regulation, and we have not got good even age boundaries that exist on social media platforms. And as Georgina was pointing out, we have a similar sort of problem with gaming as well. But nonetheless, it doesn't mean to say that there aren't things that we can do to militate against it, rather than see the whole thing as being bad news.
Thank you, Paul. Just a very quick question before we finish. Carsten says, what do you think of that free social media also sell data on users, sell them to the third party? My personal view, very quickly, that it might be a point which actually might start a useful discussion with a young person about using of social media and about safety. But what are your points on that, Paul and Georgina? Paul, are you
well, just very briefly.
Yeah.
So very briefly from my end of things, there are certain platforms which are what are called copper regulated, which will put some quite clear restrictions on this, and platforms have a choice whether they actually sign up for this or not. Not all platforms do. But what I'm basically saying is that depending on the age of the child, and it does vary according to the age of the child, there are some restrictions that you can put on to ensure that that data is not shared. But again, it's one of those things I'll be picking up on the day. But I take the point that, you know, this is still a very poorly regulated environment, really.
Yeah, totally agree in terms of that poor regulation element. And I also think there's something, isn't it, about what we've been saying in terms of those conversations that we're having with our adolescents as kind of adults about online safety, or kind of sharing information with kind of unknown people or unknown, I don't know, kind of companies on the internet and things like that. So there's conversations to be had about that, and I think that's one of the ways that we can kind of tackle that and ensure that safety. But similarly, you know, we have to think that there are times when young people might share data and might share information. And so it's about how do we respond then once we find that out, and thinking about how do we structure conversations for learning.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, thank you both. We are quickly approaching 8 o'clock. I always try to make it a bit briefer, but failed miserably. Anyway, I wanted to say thank you to Georgina and to Paul for sharing some of the information with us. And another thing I want to share with all of you is that our next Thursday is actually going to take place on Tuesday, and Tuesday next week, and also at midday, not at 7 in the evening. So it's a bit of a strange one, but because, as you probably know, we're all celebrating our Queen's Platinum Jubilee next Thursday. So we had to move our Thursday to Tuesday, and that was the only time. But it's going to be a very interesting one, because Paul will be telling us about his brand new course on hoarding. And hoarding is another one of those problems which clients very rarely come to us with, but actually very often suffer. So that should be a fascinating Thursday on Tuesday at 12 o'clock, and I hope you will be able to join us. But you will obviously have a recording on our YouTube channel, which I hope you're all subscribed to by now. And now, as always, you can unmute yourself, say your goodbyes, and have a good weekend, and see you on Tuesday. Bye now.
Yeah. Thanks very much, folks.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank
Look after
you.
yourselves. Take care.
Bye.
Thank
Bye
you.
now.
Thanks a lot.
Take care.
Bye.
Look after yourselves.
Thanks for coming.
Bye.